Welcome to part 2 of my Lake Erie bike loop series. This video covers the second half of my 10-day bike trip, where starting on day 6 I traveled for 5 days from Pelee Island along the north shore of Lake Erie to Niagara Falls. So on the morning of Thursday, August 1st, 2019, I awoke at my campsite on Pelee Island and started the day with a bowl of my campsite overnight oats. By 8 a.m. I had everything packed up and began my 7-kilometer ride across Pelee Island to the ferry terminal. As I arrived on the western shore, I could see the Pelee Islander ferry pulling in, and I purchased my ticket to the Ontario side of the lake. At 9 a.m. the ferry pulled away from the dock and headed north. So yesterday this same boat brought me to Pelee Island from Sandusky, Ohio, but today it will be taking me to Kingsville, Ontario. Passing in the other direction is the Pelee Islander 2, which was launched into service earlier this year. The ride to Kingsville took about an hour and a half and cost $7.50 plus $3.75 for my bike. So from Kingsville on day 6 I'll ride east through Leamington, but after that I'll mostly be riding through a very low populated farming area. My ultimate destination is Rondeau Provincial Park, but I'll first be visiting the community of Erieau at the other end of the same bay. So at around 10:45 I made my way out of Kingsville and joined the Great Lakes Waterfront Trail signed bike route. This area is well known for its greenhouses, and in fact Leamington has the largest concentration of commercial greenhouses in all of North America. For a long time they've been known as the tomato capital of Canada, and this tomato processing plant on the right was first opened in 1908 by the H.J. Heinz Company. Outside of Leamington I had a nice stretch of quiet country roads, then reached the Wheatley Harbour. This harbour is the largest fishing port on Lake Erie, and Wheatley claims to be the freshwater fish capital of the world. In Wheatley I rode past several fish processing plants and made a quick stop to top off my water bottles. Heading east from Wheatley, the scenery was dominated by endless fields of soybeans and many wind turbines. As I rode along I enjoyed a nice snack of local blueberries that I picked up at a roadside market back in Leamington. The roads I was on transitioned from paved to hard-packed gravel to loose gravel, which was really difficult to ride through. Even though these gravel roads are actually the recommended route according to the Great Lakes Waterfront Trail, I eventually abandoned them and switched to Highway 3 instead. When I reached the community of Cedar Springs, I turned off the main road and headed towards Erieau. As I was riding, I noticed this interesting field which is growing onions. After these onions reached full maturity, they were lifted to the surface and had been left here to cure. In contrast, the onions in these adjacent rows are still growing and have not yet reached that stage in the harvest. I soon reached the community of Erieau, where I rode all the way to the end of the peninsula. The land you can see across the water is part of Rondeau Provincial Park, but the route I'll be taking to get there will be a lot longer. I stopped for a late lunch in Erieau at Molly and OJ's restaurant, where I ordered a perch burger. After lunch I continued my ride and saw lots more interesting crops along the way. I also saw many more wind turbines, and in fact today I rode through 5 separate wind farm projects, each utilizing different models of turbines. The wind today was mostly from the east, so I was fighting against it, though it wasn't that strong. By 6 p.m. I reached Rondeau, where I proceeded to the entrance of the provincial park. First established in 1894, it's the second oldest provincial park in Ontario. After registering for a campsite, I headed over to the beach for a quick swim in the lake. This beach was kind of unique because the water seemed to get deep at first, but then was very shallow again. I noticed that the water seemed a lot colder here than when I swam earlier in the trip on the south side of the lake. Back at the campsite I got to work doing a load of laundry and setting up my tent. Since there's no rain in the forecast, I'm going to try the tent tonight with the fly rolled up. At around 7:45 I got back on my bike and rode to a restaurant just outside the park called Rondeau Joe's. Since I ate a late lunch I decided to order a big salad for my meal and a yummy chocolate lava cake for dessert. I enjoyed the sunset as I ate and afterwards headed back to my campsite for a nice sleep. The next morning I let myself sleep in until 8 a.m. since I'd been up quite early the previous 2 days to catch the ferries. After my usual breakfast I decided to go for a bike ride before fully packing up my campsite. While I'm here at Rondeau I wanted to take the opportunity to explore all the way to the end of the peninsula before starting my day of riding. The trail which leads to the point used to be a complete loop, but due to erosion over the years the two trails no longer connect together, so I had to do them separately. The west trail led all the way to the point, and there was a beach there. From there I had a great view of the shoreline that I had ridden yesterday with all those wind turbines. As I made my way back I noticed that my wheel was making a funny noise. When I got back to the campsite I checked it out and discovered that my rear wheel bearing had become loose. After a quick repair with my cone wrench I packed up the rest of my campsite and exited the park. So today on day 7 I'll continue making my way along the Lake Erie shoreline, passing through mostly farmland until I reach the community of Port Stanley, where I'll be camping tonight. I began the ride on a road which follows the shoreline, including a section of roadway which is closed due to some erosion. After reaching the community of Morpeth, I joined County Road 3, which is also known as a Talbot Trail. This is a more major road than I typically prefer to ride on, but the traffic this morning is fairly light so far, and the scenery is great. After spending the last day or so in the municipality of Chatham, Kent, I've now entered Elgin County. In the community of New Glasgow, I stopped for lunch at a place called Take a Bite. I ordered their ghee warma wrap, which contains a mixture of gyro and shawarma meat, which is really tasty. After also getting my water bottles topped off, I continued riding east and into the wind. At Wallacestown, I turned off the main road and got to ride on some nice back roads. I started to notice that the ride began to get a lot more hilly, which made me realize how incredibly flat the riding had been for the past few days. I reached Port Stanley at around 4:30 and decided to explore around a bit. Built at the mouth of the Kettle Creek, Port Stanley has a long history which stretches back to the 1600s. Port Stanley doesn't have any campgrounds, but instead tonight I'll be camping in someone's yard thanks to a connection I made on a website called Warm Showers. After exploring to the end of the pier, I made my way to the house, which is conveniently located very close to the beach. To celebrate the completion of my day of riding, I enjoyed a nice refreshing dip in the lake. After getting my tent set up, I got on my bike and rode back to the center of Port Stanley. I explored around a bit more, then stopped at Foodland to stock up on some groceries. Afterwards, I stopped at a restaurant called Piz Axel's, where I ordered their chicken bacon ranch pizza. Today is the Friday of a long weekend, and I've noticed lots of historic vehicles out on the road tonight. After dinner, I rode down to the main beach and enjoyed an ice cream cone at sunset before making my way back to the yard where I'll be camping. Back at the house, I had a quick shower, then climbed into my tent for a comfortable sleep. I want to give a big thank you to Terry and his family for hosting me here in their yard in Port Stanley. The next morning, I got up around 7:30 and enjoyed my breakfast on the beach. The lake is fairly calm and still so far this morning. Near the end of my ride yesterday, I noticed that the seam which supports the pocket on the back of my recumbent seat had failed, so I decided to attempt a quick repair. In my tool bag, I carry a small sewing kit for this exact situation, and with it I was able to do a successful repair. After packing up my tent, I was on the road by 9:15 a.m. So today on day 8, I'll continue riding east, passing through Port Bruce and Port Burwell before arriving at Bacchus Heritage Conservation Area, where I'll be camping just outside of Port Rowan. After I check in at the campground, I'm also hoping to explore down to visit Long Point. So after leaving Port Stanley, I rode on some nice quiet roads passing through farmland. This is the closest road which runs next to the lake, but in most spots the water is out of sight. After about 20 kilometers, I reached the community of Port Bruce. Port Bruce is located at the mouth of Catfish Creek, and last year their only bridge spanning the creek collapsed in a bad storm. This small single-lane bridge was installed as a temporary measure until the main highway bridge is replaced. This field on my right is growing tobacco plants, and you can see there's a farmer in the field inspecting his crops. On these trips, I enjoy trying to identify the different crops that I see. The majority of the fields I've been seeing in Ontario are either corn or soybeans, but this one appears to be growing pumpkins. The next community I reached was Port Burwell, which is at the mouth of Big Otter Creek. This harbor served as an important transportation hub, and there used to be a railway ferry which traveled across the lake from here to Ashtabula, Ohio, where I visited back on day 3 of this trip. I spotted this little building with a sign that said "Tickle My Ivory," and I couldn't help myself. I love outdoor pianos like this, but people have been tickling these ivories so much that there's almost none left. I stopped at a nearby restaurant for lunch and ordered an egg salad sub. Speaking of subs, Port Burwell is the home of the HMCS Ojibwa, which served the Canadian military from 1965 until 1998. After lunch, I continued riding and saw a few more unique looking crops. Some of them I couldn't easily identify, but I know that this shaded one here is ginseng. I believe they're harvesting winter wheat on this field, which gets its name because it's planted in the fall and not harvested until the following summer. I eventually reached Bacchus Heritage Conservation Area, where I purchased a camping permit for tonight. After arriving, I quickly got to work setting up my tent. Something that sets this campground apart from others where I've stayed is that Bacchus Heritage Conservation Area contains its own pioneer village. Many of these old buildings were brought here from the surrounding area and have been filled with artifacts from the time period when they were built. I arrived just as they were starting to close everything for the day, so my tour was very quick but interesting. The historical significance of this location is that it's the home of the Backhouse grist mill, which was built here in 1798. Powered by water from Dedrick's Creek, this mill remained in continuous operation longer than any other mill in Ontario. At around 5 p.m. I made my way out of the park to explore down to Long Point. After passing through the small community of Port Rowan, I reached Lake Erie again and made my way along Long Point Road. Long Point is known for its sandy beaches, so I decided to stop in for a quick swim in the lake. Long Point actually has its own provincial park, which I had originally been planning on camping at, but due to the higher than usual water levels in the lake this summer, most of the park is closed. On my way back, I spotted a family of swans and a great blue heron. Back in Port Rowan, I rode my bike out to the end of the harbor pier, then stopped for dinner at a restaurant called Country Fork. From the menu, I ordered their roast pork loin meal. After dinner, I got a delicious marshmallow ice cream sundae from Twins Ice Cream Parlor. As the sun was setting, I rode back to the campground just in time to catch the tail end of their barn square dance hoedown.
Slide to the left, right? Yeah, okay. Get ready to start again. Out.
Afterwards, I had a shower and got ready for a nice sleep in my tent. Feeling well rested, I awoke the next morning at 7:30 a.m. and enjoyed my overnight oats breakfast. With everything loaded onto my bike, I made my way to the campground at 9 a.m. Today I'll be riding east to Pelee Island Conservation Area, which is just outside of the community of Dunnville. Since I've already ridden this segment of the Lake Erie waterfront on a trip I did last summer, I decided to take a route which is further inland this time for a change of scenery. As I started my ride this morning, I noticed that the wind was coming from the northeast. I'd really been expecting that I'd have almost exclusively tailwinds for the westward portion of my trip, but so far the opposite has been true. I've been passing several more tobacco farms this morning, but I'm not sure what crop is growing in this field. Just like yesterday, I saw more shaded fields which are growing ginseng. Some crops are really hard to identify, so I certainly appreciate that this Scotland company has neatly labeled some of their fields. In addition to the specialty crops, there are also cornfields in this area, and I had the pleasure of watching a cornfield being harvested. This machine is designed to harvest 4 rows of corn simultaneously, cutting each stalk from the field, separating each ear of corn from the stalk, and tossing them into the collection bin behind. The corn which is being harvested here is sweet corn, as opposed to grain corn or field corn, which is harvested much later in the season after the plants have turned light brown. In another field not far away, this very different machine, which is called a combine, is harvesting winter wheat. Considering the crops in these fields are only harvested once per year, it's neat getting to stop and watch the harvest as I'm riding. I believe these unusual brown structures are used for drying tobacco plants, the same as these white prefab buildings. I eventually reached the community of Simcoe, where I made a brief stop to replenish my water supply. Not long after that, I entered Haldimand County as I continued riding east. The crops in Haldimand County don't seem to be as diversified as Norfolk County, but the roads I've selected are very quiet and peaceful with virtually no traffic. To help pass the time on the road, I've been listening to a local oldies radio station on my portable AM/FM radio. When I reached River Road, I headed north towards the community of Cayuga. Cayuga is one of the few places in this area where you can cross the Grand River, which is the largest river in southwestern Ontario. After a quick stop at Foodland to get some groceries, I stopped for lunch at the Back 40 Tap and Grill, where I ordered a grilled chicken sandwich. When I finished my lunch, I crossed back over to the west side of the river and rejoined River Road heading south. I've truly been spoiled today with really nice, quiet country roads to ride on. I noticed this unusual pair of large birds who walked across the road in front of me and then made their way into a neighboring field. With some research, I believe they're called sandhill cranes. Not long after that, I reached the entrance to Pelee Island Conservation Area, which will be my final campground of this 10-day trip. The place seems to be quite busy on this Sunday of the long weekend, but thankfully I made a reservation ahead of time for a campsite on the island. After setting up my tent, I went and explored a bit around the park, which is situated on the bank of the Grand River. There doesn't seem to be any swimming areas of the river in the park, but they do have a very large swimming pool. I decided to go in for a quick dip. I had a quick shower, then got back on the road and made a short trip across the river to the community of Dunnville. Riding through this town brought back fond memories from the morning I stopped here for breakfast on a bike trip I did last summer. On this visit, I stopped for dinner at an old restaurant called Queen's Merit Room, and I ordered their chicken fettuccine alfredo. Even though I've already ridden quite far today, I decided to go for an after-dinner ride down to Port Maitland. Nestled amongst these wind turbines is the No. 6 Royal Canadian Air Force Dunnville Museum. Not far from there on the side of the road I spotted a baby deer. Eventually I reached Port Maitland, which is at the mouth of the Grand River on Lake Erie. I decided to ride my bike out to the end of the harbour pier. The pier was packed with dozens of people fishing, and it must be a great night for it since the lake is extremely calm and still right now. At the end of the pier there's a small lighthouse, and I was also able to get a great view looking east at the beach of Rock Point Provincial Park where I swam last May. I turned on my bike lights and made my way back to Pelee Island as the sun was setting. Back at my campsite I had some noisy neighbors, but I was eventually able to get to sleep. I woke up the next morning at 7:30 a.m. to my usual breakfast. By 9 o'clock my campsite was packed up and I was on the road to begin my final day of riding. So today on day 10 I'll be riding to Niagara Falls, which will complete my 10-day loop of Lake Erie. When I get to Port Colborne I'll be turning and following the Welland Canal trail all the way to Port Weller, and then continuing to Niagara-on-the-Lake before eventually reaching my destination. Admittedly this isn't the most direct route, but it'll let me cover lots of new territory that I've never ridden before. After crossing over the Grand River I made my way through Dunnville onto a quiet back road. This led me to Canal Bank Road, which follows along beside the old feeder canal. In its first iteration, the feeder canal fed the locks of the Welland Canal using water from the Grand River in Dunnville. I eventually made my way down to the Lake Erie Shoreline, where I joined Lakeshore Road and soon crossed from Haldimand County into Niagara region. Out in the lake I spotted a big cargo ship heading east towards Port Colborne. This part of the lakefront has lots of cottages and summer homes. I eventually reached the city of Port Colborne, which has a population of about 18,000 and is the southern terminus of the Welland Canal. There were plenty of big ships docked at Port Colborne, including the Pearl Mist cruise ship, which operates cruises on the Great Lakes between Milwaukee and Toronto during the summer months. The ship I had seen out on the lake earlier was the Pole Steam Wicco, which I waited around to watch as it began its northern journey through the Welland Canal towards Lake Ontario. There's a nice bike path which follows along the route of the canal, which I'll be riding on for the next 40 kilometers. Through a series of 8 locks, the Welland Canal allows ships to pass between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. This canal is actually in its 4th iteration, with the first iteration having been completed in 1833, which included 40 wooden locks. Pictured here is the Welland International Flatwater Centre, which sits on a portion of the canal which was made obsolete in 1973 with the completion of the Welland Bypass. Another interesting feature of the Welland Canal is the free passenger ferry at Port Robinson. I decided to take advantage of this ferry to cross to the other side of the canal to have lunch in Port Robinson. There used to be a bridge which spanned the canal here, but it was destroyed in 1974 when a cargo ship collided with it. Port Robinson only has one restaurant and it's called Bridge 12 Pub and Eatery. I selected a nice table outside and ordered myself a meatball sub. After lunch I returned to the ferry dock and waited for the small ferry boat to come and pick me back up. The ferry is operated by the city of Thorold and they use just a small pontoon boat. Back on the west side of the canal I continued north and managed to catch back up to the Pole Steam Wicco, which had passed me while I was stopped for lunch. On the right is the Thorold cogeneration plant, which generates electricity from natural gas and uses the waste heat to supply steam to the paper mill which is adjacent to it. I've now reached Lock 7, which is just closing its gates to begin lowering a big ship down its first step of the Niagara Escarpment. Further downstream from here are Locks 6, 5, and 4, which are a twin flight of locks, meaning that there are 2 separate passages that ships can take through these 3 back-to-back locks. When I eventually reached Lock 1, I crossed the bridge over to the east side of the canal and started heading towards Niagara-on-the-Lake. I noticed these pickup trucks where the roofs and windshields had been removed, presumably to allow them to drive below the trees of the orchards which dominate this area. I eventually reached the historic community of Niagara-on-the-Lake, where I rode over to get a view of Lake Ontario. Across on the opposite shore I can just barely see the skyline of my home city. First settled in 1781, this community served as the original capital city of Upper Canada. It's also the home of Fort George and sits opposite Youngstown, New York across the Niagara River. From Niagara-on-the-Lake I began my journey south along the Niagara Parkway trail. The trail was really scenic, although I had some major hill climbing when I reached Queenston to regain all the altitude I lost riding down the escarpment earlier. At the top of the hill I rode over top of the Sir Adam Beck hydroelectric generating stations, which have a nameplate capacity of nearly 2,000 megawatts. Over on the American side of the river sits the Robert Moses Niagara hydroelectric power station with a nameplate capacity of 2675 megawatts. Further upstream I rode past the Niagara Whirlpool, which is a large bulge of the Niagara River which has a circular flow. Not long after that I reached Niagara Falls, which is a great destination to mark the completion of my 10-day loop. After celebrating my accomplishment, I made my way through the streets of Niagara Falls to the train station to catch the 7:20 Niagara Falls excursion train back to Toronto. As the train passed over the Welland Canal, I once again spotted the Polstein Wicko as it was slowly making its way towards Lock 3. After about 2 hours, the train arrived back at Union Station, and I rode my bike through the streets of Toronto back to my home. When I tally up my total distances from each day of the trip, I get 1,244 kilometers, making this the longest bike trip I've ever done. With so many days of great weather and lots of interesting scenery, I'd also rank this my favorite bike trip so far, and would certainly recommend trying a loop of Lake Erie yourself. Despite spending half the trip in the USA with an unfavorable currency exchange rate, it still ended up being quite affordable for a 10-day vacation. Bike touring is truly a great way to spend a holiday, and if you've never tried it before, I'd strongly recommend it. If you've watched all the way to the end of this 10-day trip, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below, and thanks for watching.